Stephanie, thank you. Well, with me now are three leading economists, Dr. Irwin Stelzer of the Hudson Institute, Nobel Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz, who advised the Greek government on its deficit reduction measures, and the German economist Christian Dussmann. Do we all agree that the euro will survive, and if so, in what form? Joe Stiglitz.
Well, I'm very hopeful that it will. I think it's been a great deal of benefit. I think there is still some uncertainty. The uncertainty is a result of the failure that Stephanie mentioned to, when they created the euro, there was a great deal of divergence. They didn't put in the fiscal framework, what I would call a solidarity fund for stabilization, that is needed. Where I would disagree with Stephanie, the point is that we're talking about a long-term enterprise. Changes occur all the time. You know, 3 years ago, you would have said Ireland is a very competitive economy, and now it's one of the economies that's in trouble. Spain had a surplus. You couldn't criticize Spain for its fiscal measures, and now it has a deficit. So the question is, do you have a framework that can adapt to the very rapidly changing economic circumstances? And I think the answer is, so far, no.
Irwin Stelzer, I mean, this is a bump in the road, a big bump in the road, but the euro will survive somehow.
Well, I think that the political class is dedicated to its survival, so that is a plus. But I think, as Professor Stiglitz pointed out, there are wide changes very often in the relative positions of these economies, and a single interest rate with no fiscal balancing force is going to make life very difficult. I think they will overcome the difficulty, not for economic reasons, but because of the political, emotional attachment that the political class has to the euro. But it will, if it does survive, will survive, I think, at a much lower exchange rate relative to other currencies.
Christian Dussmann, I just wondered whether Germany would actually welcome a lower exchange rate. 15% devaluation against the dollar is fantastic for all the things that Germany makes.
Sure, for German manufacturing and German industry, this is a very welcome development. And so German industry has said repeatedly over the last weeks and months. However, I'm a little bit more optimistic about the euro. I think the problems we have seen over the last decade or so were problems which were of more structural nature. We have seen important divergences between different European countries in terms of competitiveness. While Germany used the period between the late 70s and the early 2000s to restructure its economy, we had real wages decreasing below the second decile of the distribution for quite some years, for instance. Countries like Greece, Italy, Spain and Portugal did not undertake these very important reforms.
But isn't that an argument for some of them falling out of the euro? If the euro continues, that they're going to have a lot of pain. I'll come to Joe Stiglitz in a minute, who advised the Greek government. They're going to have a lot of pain. Maybe Greece shouldn't be in the euro.
Well, there are very different cultures in different European countries. And I would think that the current development comes to some politicians who actually want these countries to be more meritocratic, to be their economies to be more competitive, quite welcome, because it gives them the political possibility, the political power to impose these changes.
Well, I wondered whether that goes to the heart of what I was talking about earlier with Stephanie, which is, you know, the fundamental differences between Greece and Germany are so huge that you can't paper over them with a common currency.
Well, there is a theory called the optimal currency area. My colleague at Columbia, Bob Mundell, helped develop that theory. And when you look at the conditions in Europe, did it satisfy the optimal currency? Their question was clearly no. The question is, could you make up for those deficiencies with an adequate fiscal framework, which includes the kind of solidarity funds when one part of the union had a shock that was different from another. So far, there have not been those solidarity funds.
But you can see the political problems. I mean, Irwin Stelzer was talking about them. Come to him just a second on this. Angela Merkel's having difficulty selling this. She's not going to be able to sell, let's have another pot of gold to bail out any future Portugal, Spain, if they come into the same problems.
Is that a question? I would hesitate to use the word bailout. And one way of thinking about this is to go back to a crisis 12 years ago in Brazil, where people wondered, was Brazil going to go default? What was going to happen? Brazil got a loan, it repaid the loan, and today Brazil's debt-GDP ratio has gone way down.
Irwin Stelzer?
Well, I think we're sort of skating on the surface a little bit and avoiding two problems. One is that the welfare state, as conceived by these countries, is simply not affordable. And they're going to have to wrestle with reining in the welfare state, just as Britain will have to, and that's very painful. And second, Germany, I think I mentioned this in my Sunday Times column, Germany has become the China of Europe. It sells things to countries that the countries can't afford, and then it lends them the money to pay for it. That's no more sustainable, I think, in Europe than it's going to prove to be for the United States.
Would it, Irwin Stelzer, make any difference if Eurozone countries submit their budget in some way to the EU for approval and it's all nodded through, and then we can see who's falling behind or who's not?
Yes, if you have a mechanism, of course, to enforce it. I think Professor Stiglitz is absolutely right. If you had a fiscal mechanism where you could have essentially unified fiscal policy, the sort of thing that David Cameron said that Britain would never submit to, you'd have to have a real surrender of sovereignty in order to have that happen. And I don't know, as Germany or anyone else is prepared to do that.
Yeah, I want to go back to Spain, because Spain had a surplus before the crisis. So this is not a question that comes out of fiscal profligacy. When you have a shock to the system, and there's a shock that's come from a number of sources, it's a global shock, the question is, you've taken away two critical adjustment mechanisms when you formed the euro. You took away the exchange rate mechanism and the interest rate mechanism, and you didn't put into place something to substitute. And that means there's a problem. And I think the focus on this fiscal discipline is really misguided and could actually lead to even greater problems, because...
What, you mean social problems? You mean problems on the streets, for example?
As an example, but, you know, we're going back to Hooverite economics. What we're saying is the countries have to contract their spending. That's what led the stock market crash of '29 into the Great Depression.
Right, but I can't imagine Angela Merkel standing in front of her parliamentarians and saying fiscal discipline may be not such a great idea. I mean, she has got to be really, really tough on this, isn't she?
No, of course not. I'm pretty convinced that it's not just about fiscal discipline. It's about reforming labor markets and reforming economic structures. Now, exactly that has been happening in Germany over the last decade, as I said before, and that was very costly. So if we look at Germany between 1997 and 2003, growth was around 1%, sometimes below 1%. Wages decreased below the second decile of the distribution, and it was very hurtful for people. Now, out of this process, Germany emerged much more competitive than most of its probably all of its European competitors, and is in a very good position right now. However, in other countries, this process has not happened, and it has to happen now. So that, I think, is extremely important to emphasize.
Irwin Stelzer, I was just thinking, given what David Cameron had to say today, and given the tenor of this conversation, the chances of Britain ever joining the euro just don't exist, do they?
Oh, I think they definitely don't exist. I mean, that's the greatest legacy that Gordon Brown has left, is not having joined the euro. I can't imagine a referendum that would result in Britain wanting to join the euro. I couldn't imagine it before this crisis, and I certainly can't imagine it now.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you all very much. Well, one phrase that we've heard